It's April 1652, and Jan van Riebeeck stands on the deck of the Dromedaris, watching the rocky coastline of the Cape of Good Hope emerge from the morning mist. In his leather satchel, he carries sealed orders from the most powerful trading company in the world, the Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC. These aren't just instructions for establishing a refreshment station. They're a blueprint for absolute control. Behind him, 2 more ships carry 90 men, supplies, and something far more valuable. A proven system of colonial domination that has made the VOC the richest corporation in human history. What van Riebeeck doesn't know is that he's about to implement 6 control mechanisms so effective, they'll shape South African society for centuries to come. Among his men is Leendert Cornelis, a former soldier who will become the colony's first land surveyor. There's also Roelof de Man, a skilled administrator who understands the VOC's methods better than anyone. And standing quietly near the bow is Auchumau, a Khoi interpreter, who has no idea he's about to witness the systematic dismantling of his people's way of life. The VOC didn't just establish a colony. They engineered a system of control so sophisticated, it became the template for European dominance across Africa.
Hello, I'm Dr. Adam Cameron, and this is Missing History Records.
Van Riebeeck and his men weren't just settlers, they were agents of the most successful multinational corporation in history. The VOC had already conquered trade routes across Asia, controlled entire kingdoms, and amassed wealth that dwarfed most European nations. Now, they were bringing their proven methods to African soil. But how exactly did a trading company with just 90 men control a territory larger than most European countries? What methods did they use to dominate indigenous populations who had lived here for thousands of years? And how did they maintain absolute authority over Dutch settlers who were thousands of miles from home? The answers reveal 6 distinct control mechanisms that were far more sophisticated than simple military force. These weren't random acts of colonial oppression, they were carefully planned strategies developed by corporate executives in Amsterdam and implemented with ruthless efficiency at the Cape. From economic manipulation to psychological warfare, from legal frameworks to social engineering, the VOC's control methods were so effective, they became the blueprint for European colonialism across the entire continent. Some of these techniques were so subtle, people didn't even realize they were being controlled. In this documentary, we'll uncover 6 specific ways the VOC established and maintained absolute control over the Cape Colony between 1652 and 1700. These methods didn't just shape the early colony. They created power structures that would define South African society for centuries to come. This is the story of how a trading company became an empire, and how corporate control became colonial domination. By 1652, the Dutch East India Company wasn't just a trading company. It was a corporate superpower, controlling more territory than most nations, and commanding military forces larger than many European armies. The VOC had been granted extraordinary powers by the Dutch States General in 1602. They could wage war, negotiate treaties, establish colonies, mint currency, and exercise judicial authority. When the VOC decided to establish a permanent settlement at the Cape of Good Hope, they weren't starting from scratch. They were deploying proven strategies that had already subjugated vast territories across Asia. The Cape wasn't chosen randomly. It was a strategic necessity. VOC ships traveling to and from their Asian territories needed a reliable stopping point, and the Cape provided the perfect halfway mark. The indigenous peoples of the Cape had lived there for thousands of years. The Khoi pastoralists had developed sophisticated societies based on cattle herding and seasonal migrations. The San hunter-gatherers had created complex social structures, perfectly adapted to the harsh inland territories. Both groups had their own systems of governance, trade networks, and spiritual beliefs, but the VOC saw none of this complexity. To them, the Cape was empty land waiting to be controlled, populated by primitive peoples who could be easily manipulated or displaced. This worldview wasn't born from ignorance. It was a calculated corporate strategy that had already worked across their Asian empire. The VOC's approach to colonization was fundamentally different from other European powers. While the Spanish sought gold and glory, and the Portuguese focused on religious conversion, The Dutch were purely pragmatic. They wanted profit, and they had developed the most efficient methods for extracting it from colonial territories. Van Riebeeck's instructions from the VOC board were remarkably specific. He was to establish a fort, create defensive positions, plant gardens to supply fresh food, and maintain friendly relations with the indigenous population, but only as long as it served VOC interests. The moment cooperation became inconvenient, he had full authority to use force. What made the VOC's control so effective was their systematic approach. They didn't rely on charismatic leaders or military might alone. They created institutional structures that could function regardless of individual personalities. This corporate approach to colonization would prove devastatingly effective at the Cape. Now that the Dutch East India Company had landed, their real work began. Over the next few decades, they would implement 6 powerful methods of control strategies so effective they would shape South African society for centuries. Let's begin with the first, and perhaps the most critical, economic monopolization and total resource control. The VOC's first and most fundamental control mechanism was their systematic monopolization of the Cape's economy. From the moment Van Riebeeck stepped ashore, every aspect of economic life was designed to serve VOC interests and eliminate any possibility of independent wealth creation. The company's approach was elegantly simple: control the means of production, monopolize trade, and make everyone dependent on VOC systems. Within months of arrival, Van Riebeeck had established the company's exclusive right to trade with indigenous peoples. No colonist could engage in independent trade with the Khoi or San without VOC permission. This wasn't just a rule, it was enforced with severe penalties, including imprisonment and deportation. The VOC's economic control extended to every aspect of colonial life. They controlled the supply of tools, seeds, and building materials. They determined what crops could be grown and where they could be sold. They set prices for all goods and services. Most importantly, they maintained absolute control over shipping. The only way to send goods to, or receive them from, the outside world. Consider the case of the free burghers, the Dutch colonists who were released from VOC service and allowed to become independent farmers. The company presented this as generous liberation, but it was actually a sophisticated form of economic control. These free farmers were required to sell their produce exclusively to the VOC at prices set by the company. They could only buy supplies from VOC stores at company-determined rates. They were free in name only. The VOC's monopoly on trade with indigenous peoples was particularly devastating. The Khoi had developed extensive trade networks over centuries, exchanging cattle, ivory, and other goods across vast distances. The VOC systematically dismantled these networks, forcing all trade to flow through their controlled channels. Within a few years, traditional Khoi economic systems had been largely destroyed. The company's control over land allocation was equally strategic. The VOC retained ownership of all land, but granted usage rights to colonists under strict conditions. These grants could be revoked at any time, ensuring that even successful farmers remained dependent on company goodwill. The VOC used this power, ruthlessly redistributing land to reward loyalty and punish dissent. Perhaps most insidiously, the VOC controlled access to credit and capital. They were the only source of loans for colonists wanting to expand their farms or start new enterprises. This created a system of perpetual debt that bound colonists to the company. Those who couldn't meet their obligations and found their land confiscated and their families deported. The psychological impact of this economic control was profound. Colonists quickly learned that their survival depended not on their skills or hard work, but on their ability to navigate VOC bureaucracy and maintain company favor. This created a culture of dependency that would shape Cape society for generations. Between 1655 and 1665, the VOC implemented its second major control mechanism, the establishment of a comprehensive legal system that gave the company absolute judicial authority over every aspect of colonial life. This wasn't simply about maintaining order, it was about creating a legal framework that legitimized VOC control and made resistance legally impossible. The Council of Policy, established in 1655, became the supreme governing body of the Cape Colony. Chaired by the VOC commander, it combined executive, legislative, and judicial powers in a single institution controlled entirely by company officials. There was no separation of powers, no checks and balances, and no appeals process beyond the company hierarchy. The VOC's legal system was revolutionary in its scope and sophistication. They created detailed codes covering everything from property rights to marriage laws, from trade regulations to criminal justice. These laws weren't based on Dutch legal traditions. They were specifically designed to serve VOC interests and eliminate any potential challenges to company authority. The company's control over the legal system extended to the most intimate aspects of colonial life. Marriage between colonists required VOC approval. Religious practices were regulated by company officials. Even personal disputes between colonists were subject to company arbitration. The VOC didn't just govern the colony, they controlled the colonists' personal lives. The legal treatment of indigenous peoples revealed the true nature of VOC control. The company created a dual legal system where Dutch colonists were subject to one set of laws and indigenous peoples to another. Khoi and San had no legal rights, no recourse against company decisions, and no protection under colonial law. They existed in a legal limbo that made them completely vulnerable to company exploitation. The VOC's judicial monopoly was enforced through a network of company officials who served as judges, prosecutors, and executioners. These men were trained in company procedures, but had no legal education or understanding of justice beyond VOC interests. They were corporate employees first, judges second. The company's legal innovations extended to property law, where they created systems that had never existed in Dutch jurisprudence. The VOC claimed ownership of all land in the colony, but they allowed colonists to hold usage rights under specific conditions. These rights could be transferred, inherited, or revoked, according to company rules that changed whenever VOC interests demanded. The psychological impact of this legal control was devastating. Colonists lived in constant uncertainty about their legal status and rights. They knew that any conflict with VOC officials could result in the loss of their property, their livelihood, or their freedom. This created a culture of compliance, one that made organized resistance almost impossible. Between 1656 and 1670, the VOC implemented its third major control mechanism, a systematic monopolization of information and communication networks. In an age before mass media, controlling the flow of information was perhaps the most powerful tool of colonial domination. The company maintained absolute control over all correspondence between the Cape Colony and the outside world. Every letter, every document, every piece of information that entered or left the colony passed through VOC censors. This wasn't just about security, it was about controlling the narrative and preventing any outside interference in company operations. The VOC's information control began with their monopoly on shipping. Since all ships traveling to and from the Cape were company vessels, the VOC could monitor and control every piece of correspondence. They opened and read all letters, censored unfavorable reports, and blocked any communication that might damage company interests. Within the colony, the VOC controlled the flow of information through their administrative network. Company officials were the only source of news about the outside world, updates on company policy, and information about conditions in other parts of the VOC empire. This made colonists completely dependent on company sources for their understanding of their situation. The company's control over record-keeping was equally strategic. All official documents, legal records, and administrative papers were created and maintained by VOC officials. They could alter, destroy, or fabricate records as needed to support company interests. This made it nearly impossible for colonists to challenge company decisions or document company abuses. The VOC's information control extended to their treatment of indigenous peoples. They systematically suppressed traditional forms of communication and knowledge sharing among Khoi and San communities. Traditional leadership structures were undermined, cultural practices were disrupted, and the oral traditions that had preserved indigenous knowledge for generations were deliberately fragmented. The company's monopoly on maps and geographical information was particularly significant. The VOC jealously guarded their knowledge of local geography, preventing colonists from developing any independent understanding of the land beyond their settlements. This kept colonists dependent on company guides and blocked them from creating their own trade routes or settlements. Perhaps most insidiously, the VOC controlled the flow of information about company policies and decisions. Colonists were often unaware of changes in policy until they had already been implemented. This prevented any organized resistance and kept them in a state of constant uncertainty. The psychological impact of this information control was profound. Colonists lived in an information vacuum where they knew only what the company wanted them to know. They had no independent sources, no way to verify company claims, and no ability to communicate their situation to potential allies outside the colony. Between 1660 and 1680, the VOC implemented its fourth major control mechanism, a sophisticated program of social engineering designed to create cultural divisions and prevent unified resistance to company rule. This wasn't accidental. It was a carefully planned strategy based on the company's experience across their global empire. The VOC's approach to social control was based on the principle of divide and conquer. They systematically created and reinforced divisions between different groups in the colony, ensuring that potential opposition remained fragmented and unable to unite against company rule. This strategy was so effective, it became the template for colonial social engineering across Africa. The company's treatment of the free burghers exemplified this approach. Rather than building a unified colonial society, the VOC deliberately maintained class distinctions between company employees and free settlers. Company officials enjoyed superior status, better living conditions, and greater privileges. Free burghers? They were made to feel like second-class citizens in their own colony. The VOC's social engineering was most visible in their treatment of different ethnic groups. They created a complex hierarchy, Dutch company officials at the top, followed by free burghers, then mixed-race individuals, and finally indigenous peoples and slaves at the very bottom. This hierarchy wasn't based on traditional social structures, it was a deliberate company creation, designed to prevent cross-racial alliances. Their manipulation of marriage and family relationships was particularly sophisticated. The VOC controlled who could marry whom, under what conditions, and with what legal consequences. Mixed marriages were tightly regulated to serve company interests, creating a population of mixed-race individuals who were dependent on company protection, yet excluded from full colonial society. The VOC's cultural manipulation extended to religious practices. While they maintained official support for the Dutch Reformed Church, they used religious authority to reinforce company control. Ministers were company employees who preached obedience to VOC authority as a religious duty. They used biblical texts to justify company policies and to discourage resistance. Their approach to education was just as calculated. The VOC controlled all formal education in the colony, ensuring that children learned company-approved versions of history, geography, and social hierarchy. This created a generation of colonists socialized to accept VOC rule as natural and legitimate. But the VOC's social engineering was most devastating in its treatment of indigenous peoples. They systematically destroyed traditional social structures, disrupted kinship networks, and undermined indigenous authority systems. Traditional leaders were either co-opted into company service or marginalized and replaced by company-approved collaborators. The psychological impact of this social engineering was profound. It created a colonial society where everyone understood their place in the company-created hierarchy, and where challenging that hierarchy seemed both impossible and unnatural. This system of social control was so effective that it outlasted the VOC itself and continued to shape South African society for centuries. Between 1670 and 1690, the VOC implemented its fifth major control mechanism. The VOC's fifth control mechanism was their systematic integration of military power with administrative authority, creating a security apparatus that could respond instantly to any threat to company rule. This wasn't simply about maintaining an army, it was about creating a military administrative complex that made resistance practically impossible. The company's military strategy was based on the principle of overwhelming force. Combined with intimate knowledge of local conditions, they maintained a professional military force, far superior to anything that could be assembled by potential opponents. But they also created intelligence networks that could identify and neutralize threats before they became dangerous. The VOC's military organization was revolutionary in its efficiency and scope. They combined European military technology with local knowledge, creating forces that could operate effectively in African conditions. Their soldiers were equipped with advanced firearms, trained in European tactics, and supported by sophisticated logistics networks. Capable of maintaining military operations across vast distances, the company's integration of military and administrative functions was particularly effective. Military commanders were also civil administrators, and civil administrators had military authority. This meant that any challenge to company policy could be met with immediate military response, without the delays and complications of separate military and civil chains of command. The VOC's military control extended to the colonist population itself. All male colonists were required to serve in the colonial militia, but this militia was commanded by company officers and could be used to enforce company policy against fellow colonists. This created a system where the colonists themselves became instruments of company control. The company's military strategy included sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations. They maintained networks of informants among all population groups, including indigenous peoples, slaves, and colonists. These networks provided early warning of potential resistance movements and allowed the company to neutralize threats before they could organize effectively. The VOC's military control was most visible in their treatment of indigenous resistance. When the Khoi-Dutch Wars broke out in the 1650s and 1670s, the company's military response was swift and devastating. They didn't just defeat indigenous forces, they systematically destroyed the economic and social foundations that could support future resistance. The company's military innovations included the development of new tactics, specifically designed for African conditions. They created mobile forces that could operate in difficult terrain, established fortified positions that could control key geographic locations, and developed supply systems that could maintain military operations far from their main bases. The psychological impact of VOC military control was as important as its physical effects. The company's overwhelming military superiority created a sense of hopelessness among potential opponents. Resistance seemed not just dangerous, but futile, leading many to accept company rule as inevitable and permanent. Between 1680 and 1700, the VOC implemented its sixth and final major control mechanism. The VOC's sixth and final control mechanism was their development of a comprehensive administrative system, one that penetrated every aspect of colonial life. By 1680, the company had created a bureaucratic apparatus so thorough and so efficient that it could monitor and control virtually every activity in the colony. The company's administrative system was based on detailed record-keeping and systematic monitoring of all colonial activities. Every transaction, every movement, every significant event was documented and reported through company channels. This created an information system that gave VOC officials unprecedented knowledge of colonial conditions and potential problems. The VOC's bureaucratic control extended to the most mundane aspects of daily life. Colonists needed company permits to travel, company approval to marry, company authorization to buy or sell property, and company licenses to engage in most economic activities. This created a system of administrative dependency that made it impossible to function without company approval. The company's administrative penetration was most visible in their tax collection system. The VOC didn't just collect taxes, they created comprehensive systems for monitoring colonial wealth and ensuring that the company received its share of all economic activity. Tax collectors were also intelligence agents who reported on colonist activities and attitudes. The VOC's administrative control included sophisticated systems for managing different population groups. They created separate administrative categories for different ethnic groups, each with its own rules, requirements, and limitations. This administrative apartheid reinforced social divisions and prevented unified resistance to company rule. The company's bureaucratic innovations included the development of standardized procedures for virtually every aspect of colonial administration. These procedures were designed to ensure consistency across different administrators and to prevent individual officials from developing independent power bases that might challenge company authority. The VOC's administrative system was also designed to be self-reinforcing. Administrative positions were filled by company loyalists, trained in company procedures, and dependent on company favor for their careers. This created a bureaucratic class with strong incentives to maintain and expand. VOC control. The psychological impact of this administrative penetration was profound. Colonists found themselves enmeshed in a web of bureaucratic requirements that governed every aspect of their lives. And the complexity and pervasiveness of these administrative controls made resistance seem not just dangerous, but practically impossible. By 1700, the VOC had created an administrative system so comprehensive and so efficient that it could govern the colony with minimal military force. The company's bureaucratic control had become so internalized by the colonial population that most colonists couldn't even imagine an alternative to company rule. Between 1652 and 1700, the VOC built more than a colony, they built a system. And that system didn't vanish when their ships left the shore. The VOC's 6 control mechanisms didn't just shape the Cape Colony during their period of direct rule. They created institutional patterns and social structures that would define South African society for centuries to come. The company's innovations in corporate colonialism became the template for European domination across Africa. The economic impact of VOC control was perhaps the most enduring. The company's monopolization of trade and resources created economic structures that concentrated wealth in the hands of a small elite, while keeping the majority of the population in conditions of economic dependency. This pattern of economic inequality became so entrenched it persisted long after the VOC had disappeared. The legal and administrative frameworks created by the VOC provided the foundation for later colonial and apartheid legislation. The company's dual legal system, which treated different racial groups according to different laws, became the model for subsequent discriminatory legislation. The administrative categories created by the VOC to manage different population groups evolved into the rigid racial classifications that defined South African society until the end of apartheid. The social engineering programs implemented by the VOC had profound long-term consequences. The company's deliberate creation of racial hierarchies and cultural divisions became so internalized they seemed natural and inevitable to later generations. The psychological impact of these social controls was so deep, they continued to shape South African attitudes and behaviors long after their original implementation. The VOC's military and security innovations provided the template for later colonial military strategies across Africa. The company's integration of military and administrative functions, their use of indigenous collaborators, and their systematic destruction of traditional authority structures became standard practices for European colonial powers throughout the continent. Perhaps most significantly, the VOC's control mechanisms created a political culture that was fundamentally authoritarian and hierarchical. The company's systematic suppression of independent political activity, their control over information and communication, and their use of administrative power to regulate every aspect of daily life created patterns of political behavior that persisted long after the VOC had been replaced by other forms of government. The VOC's control of the Cape Colony between 1652 and 1700 represents one of the most sophisticated examples of corporate colonialism in world history. The company's 6 control mechanisms created a system of domination so effective it became the template for European colonialism across Africa. What made the VOC's control so effective was not just its comprehensiveness, but its systematic nature. These weren't random acts of oppression, they were carefully planned strategies, developed by corporate executives and implemented by trained administrators. The company's approach to colonial control was as sophisticated as their approach to global trade. The legacy of VOC control extends far beyond the Cape Colony itself. The company's innovations in corporate colonialism provided the foundation for the racial hierarchies and authoritarian political systems that would dominate South Africa for centuries. Understanding the VOC's control mechanisms is essential for understanding the origins of many problems that continue to affect South Africa today. The Dutch East India Company may have disappeared from history, but the control mechanisms they pioneered at the Cape Colony continue to influence our world today. Their legacy serves as a powerful reminder of how corporate power, when combined with political authority and military force, can create systems of domination that outlast the institutions that created them.